Hey there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Bible and Life podcast. My name is John Whitaker, and I'm the creator of the Bible and Life, and I have with me my friend, Stephen Norris. And as we've noted over the last few episodes, we are kind of changing things up. And instead of just me on the podcast, kind of having my reflections, Stephen and I have been enjoying having some conversations around this topic of discipleship and living as a disciple of Jesus. And so, welcome, Stephen. Good to have you on the podcast again as we kind of wrestle through this topic together.
I appreciate you having me back again. It's been
Yeah,
fun.
yeah. And Stephen has, as I've noted before, he's been around since the beginning, and it just seems like a really good fit for us just to make this podcast more about conversations with somebody who I really appreciate their mind and their heart. And so that's the motivation behind having Stephen on here. So we have been talking about living as disciples of Jesus and what that means and what that looks like, trying to bring maybe some more clarity, trying to wrestle with some of the tensions and the challenges in that, as well as just help us think that through. And where we started this a few weeks ago was on a very simple, clear definition that hopefully you can remind yourself of, we can remind ourselves of. I'd love to see more churches, whether they use my definition or something, their own, have a simple, clear definition of a disciple, because it can drive then everything we do, and it becomes super helpful to people. So we have been kind of just reflecting on that and wrestling with that. And that one simple statement is this: that to be a disciple means that you arrange your life to be with Jesus in order to become like Jesus. That's the statement. You arrange your life in a certain sort of way to cultivate and foster that relationship with Jesus, which is what we talked about in our last episode. We talked about abiding in and being with and figuring out ways to do that. So, being with in order to become like. And so, on this episode, we want to talk about becoming like Jesus, since that's the aim and that's really the goal of what it means to be a disciple. We just want to reflect some on that. And to begin, I just find it actually quite interesting that we've put that in our definition of a disciple. It's not uncommon for people to say, to use the phrase Christ likeness or becoming Christ like. And yet, I find it very interesting, Stephen, that um, I can't think of any place in any of the Gospels where Jesus explicitly tells us to become like him.
Hmm.
Can you think? Am I missing an obvious one? I can't think of a
Um,
text where Jesus
well,
says, your goal is to be like me per se, except that one we read a couple weeks ago out of Luke chapter 6. But that was more just about the general way discipleship worked in his world.
yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I know Paul kind of says it um, in his encouragement to the Corinthians, but and Jesus, he says lots of things like, if you hear what I'm saying and don't do them, so that's kind of a charge to be like him. But you're
Yeah.
right; it's not. He never explicitly says that I can think
Yeah.
of.
Yeah. I can't think of one either. And yet, I think that illustrates something that's really important for reading the Bible and everything else is that it may not be explicitly stated, but it's everywhere assumed. I just think it's everywhere assumed. And that he didn't feel the need to say it because everyone knew what it meant to be a disciple in his day and age. You know what I mean? I
Yep.
mean, the disciples would just assume, oh, you said, follow me. I know what
Exactly.
that means. That means I'm going to become your Talmud, your Mathetes, your disciple. I'm going to become that. And I know what that means. That means I'm following you in order to become like you. So he didn't have to tell them to do that because it was everywhere. It was just everywhere present and assumed in their culture.
Hmm.
And that's really what we were getting at in that first episode in this series out of Luke chapter 6, verse 40, where Jesus says, a mathetes, translated in some translations, student, better translated disciple. It's the word for disciple. But a disciple is not above his rabbi, his teacher, but when he's fully trained, he becomes like his teacher. And that's just the assumption that lies in the background behind the relationship between Jesus and James and John and Peter and Bartholomew and all of them. They knew, oh, I'm following him. He's my rabbi. I know what that means. I'm going to become like him. So he didn't have to say
Yeah.
it. I think that's why.
Yeah, it's like going to apprenticeship school, to be an electrician and without the intention of becoming an electrician. Wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah, what's the point, right? Like, you don't become an apprentice electrician without the goal of becoming an electrician.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, and that I'm glad you mentioned that actually, because we haven't really said that in any of these episodes, but I do feel like a, an apprentice is maybe a better synonym for the word disciple than like our modern word student, right?
Hmm.
Because a student sits in rows in a classroom, takes notes in a notebook, and takes tests and gets a grade, and that's that. But an apprentice does some of that. They'll go to some classes, right? They learn some things, right, about AC and DC currents, and they learn all these different sorts of things. And but they also go to the job site, and they're bending pipe and they're pulling wire and they're watching, and then all of a sudden they're okay. Now you've learned enough that I can trust you to at least wire in an outlet or a
Yeah.
light switch or whatever else it is, and then okay, now we're gonna get you to do a little bit more. So they do some classroom work, but they also do job site work, and the goal is to actually become what the journeyman is actually like. He's an electrician. I want to have my journeyman license someday. And that's really what a disciple is.
Yep. Yeah. John Mark Comer makes that the case for using the word apprentice, at least in our Western minds, is a more appropriate word for us. It's a better
Yeah,
word picture.
yeah. And Comer simply stealing that from Dallas Willard, who made that pretty popular in the late '90s and early 2000s. So
Yeah.
that's
Well, I've read more of Comer than I have of Willard. So
well, don't blame you. Willard's a little harder to read a little bit, but yeah. And so that's the goal, right? That's the heart of discipleship, is becoming like Jesus. And we said in that opening episode that at the components of that are becoming like him in character and like him in mission, or like him in, the way you carry out your life and what your life is all about, so that we're becoming holy by becoming like Jesus. We're adopting his character, but that's not just for our own sake. It's to serve others and to benefit others and to display God's glory in the world. And so there's this being light component, being salt component, this good for the world sort of component in our becoming like him.
yeah.
Um, and one of the things that I think is really critical for today, I mean, for the original disciples, they watched Jesus. So they saw him interact with the Pharisees. They heard him interact with the Sadducees. They watched the way he interacted with the mother who had just lost her son, or the father and his dead 12-year-old girl, right? They got to see, they could hear his tone of voice, and they could see the look in his eyes. They had all of that. They were physically there. We don't have that benefit. And I do think that's a challenge for us. That it's like, okay, so what does it really look like to be like Jesus, right? In my cultural context, in my place and time in history, what does it look like to be with Jesus? And that's where I think what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 is really helpful to us, because I think it shows us um, that Paul is carrying out Jesus' words, go and make disciples, but also shows us how he understood himself to be doing that. So 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, Paul says this. He says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Mimic me. It's actually the word in Greek, mimeo, which is we get our word mimic from. Mimic me as I mimic Christ. Follow my example as I try to follow Christ's example. So Paul is offering himself to the Corinthians as a concrete pattern, concrete example of Christ likeness, which means, again, he's making disciples of the Corinthians, but he recognizes the Corinthians didn't have the benefit that Peter did or John did, right? It's even really in some ways, Paul didn't have that.
Hmm.
So he had to learn from somebody else. So he's offering himself as a concrete example. And I think we all need that. We need, people need that, right? We, our our kids need that, but people in our congregations need that. Like, what does it look like to follow Jesus? Can we therefore say with the Apostle Paul, imitate me as I imitate Christ? Um, I think that's really important for us to reflect on and think about.
Yeah, I've always thought that that was, I used to especially think that was a really bold statement. And I do think it is a really bold statement that Paul was so confident in his walk with God that he had no hesitation to just tell people, just do what I do.
Yeah.
If you do what I do, then you will be in a good spot. And I've always thought that that was really bold, but also really cool
Yeah.
to have that level of confidence in your relationship and your character and the way that you live life out to be able to not hesitate to just tell people to copy you.
Yeah. 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 One key little detail in that sentence that I think is really important is the small little word as.
Hmm.
Imitate me as I imitate Christ.
Yep.
Which I think is really important because it would say, I think what I hear Paul saying with that word is, in those places where maybe I don't fully imitate Christ yet, scratch those ones, strike those from the record. But in the places where I do imitate Jesus, in the places where it's obvious that I'm like Jesus and the Jesus I've tried to pass on to you, in those places, copy me. At least for me, that gives me a little bit of freedom there. I mean, it tells me the
Yeah.
pattern is Jesus. The pattern isn't so much Paul, it's Jesus. Um, so in the places where Paul's life does significantly overlap with Jesus's life and Jesus' character and Jesus's habits and Jesus's way of interacting with people, in those places, um, then I can mimic Paul, right? And I think it would be true for you and I, or anyone else. Like, okay, and the pattern is Jesus, not me. And
Yep.
insofar as I live up to that pattern, copy me. In those places where you're not so sure you yet see Jesus in me, strike those from the record. We right, like, because I'm not, and none of us can fully, I don't think, embody Jesus this side of the new earth, right?
No. Yeah. I agree. I do think though that yeah, I 100%, Jesus is the pattern, and Paul's not trying to take away from that. But I can only imagine that even in the way that Paul, would fail, but recognize it and repent of it, and that's a model too, that's
Yeah.
worth paying attention to. We didn't, Jesus never gave us that role model
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
sinning and repenting of it. Um, so I do, I I think there's maybe something to that as well, because we're human and we're going to be facing that sin in our life until Jesus comes back, and
Yeah.
um, the way that we manage it, the sin in our lives, is also an example.
Yeah. Yeah. So we may not get that example exactly from Jesus because he didn't have that issue, but but it's true. People do need to know how to appropriately respond to their failings and their sin as well. I do think
Yeah.
that's a good point. Um, yeah, and one of the things that I've increasingly come back to over and over again for a couple different reasons is that to become like Jesus is not like foreign to our human nature. It's not foreign to our humanness. To become like Jesus isn't like I'm forcing my humanness to be something that's unnatural and like it's not supposed to be, right? That to become like Jesus is actually to become more fully human.
Right.
That the more holy I am, the more human I am. I don't know that we've always thought about that. We make statements like, well, I'm only human after all, or,
Hmm.
nobody's perfect, or to err is human, right?
Yeah. Or that's
As
just
if,
human nature.
yeah, it's just human nature, as if sinning and failing and all that's just human nature. Um, and thus holiness is like this alien thing that we're trying to force our human nature into. But in the story of the Bible, it's actually the opposite of that. If you start at the very beginning in Genesis 1 and 2, humans were holy for the first little bit of our history. And what's the alien invader that has somehow got into our human nature is not holiness, but it's sin. Sin is the thing that came in after the fact and ruined us, and twisted us, and messed us up. And then the rest of the story of the Bible is the story of how God is going to make humans holy again, and how he's going to restore us to proper functioning, how he's going to restore us. And so, not to go into the long story of the Bible at this point, but in the story of the Bible through Abraham and Israel, in the culmination of all of that, you get Jesus, who comes as the perfect image of God. He's the image of the invisible God, as the Apostle Paul says, right? He's the very thing that we were meant to be in the beginning when God first made us as the image of God. That image then isn't lost, but it is sullied and dirty and somehow less than and twisted. We've fallen short of the glory of God. And so, in becoming like Jesus, we're being restored to the true image of God. Paul makes that point in Colossians chapter 3, verses 5 through 10. It culminates there with it being restored to the knowledge of the image of God by looking at Jesus. Or as Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, that when you look at Jesus, he is the glory of the image of God in the face of Christ. He uses that phrase. And so as we stare at Jesus, we're seeing what God is like now in human form, and it's giving us a concrete picture of that's who I was made to be. That's who I was created to be. That's what it really means to be human. And that's why when we, in becoming Christ-like, we're actually becoming fully ourselves again, fully human again. I think that's just so important for it. It subverts not only some, it doesn't, it undoes some bad Christian thinking about it, but it also subverts the dominant story in our cultural context at this point in history.
Yeah, yeah, I do think that's really valuable, and it made me, when you mentioned that, it kind of reminded me of this idea of, that's a more complete gospel, right?
Yeah.
This idea of being, a disciple of Jesus or an apprentice of Jesus. Um, and John Mark Comer, in his book Practicing the Way, says it. I I don't remember exactly how he says it, but he basically lines out the gospel, and this is what it means to be an apprentice. And then he says something like, and unfortunately, that is not at all what it means to be a Christian. Like in the Western church,
Yeah.
we're talking about two different things here, because we've unfortunately kind of watered down the gospel to just a sinner's prayer, and Jesus died for my sins, and
Got my
I
ticket to
believe in
heaven.
him, and now I get into heaven. Exactly. Where what Jesus really called us to is a transformation
Yeah.
and living a different way. And it ends with what you're talking about there, where you're living as a different kind of human than you started, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a much bigger and more compelling vision that Jesus is offering than our truncated, diminished little gospel of Jesus died. You're a sinner. Jesus died so you can get your sins forgiven. If you pray this prayer and confess his name, you'll get your ticket to heaven. You'll go to heaven when you die. I mean, that's a very diminished gospel versus one where it's like God's plan is to redeem and restore the entire cosmos, all of earth, including human beings, put everything back to proper working order, including us, so that we can be restored to the place we had before that we've fallen from, where we're like kings and queens underneath the high king of heaven, managing earth on his behalf for his glory for all eternity. It's a much more compelling and bigger vision that I think calls to our passions and our hearts much more fully and more completely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so when we say being a disciple is becoming like Jesus, that's the story, that's the context that we're talking about. That we're getting this opportunity to become fully alive and fully human all over again. And that's really a grand and I think beautiful picture that, like I said, subverts this cultural narrative that to be genuinely human, that human flourishing happens by you just being you. You just do you, you live your truth, you look within yourself and follow your heart and do your own thing. And I think if we're just honest, that has not worked out very well for human beings
Yeah,
to go that
yeah.
way. And not to get into all this, but just as an aside, the fact is everyone who tries to follow their heart is actually following somebody else anyhow, because they've got so many conflicting aims and ambitions and desires in their hearts. To choose one set of those and go with that is to have some sort of external grid over their heart that they're saying, these are the real ones. Those other ones aren't the real ones. Well, what told you those ones were the real ones? Well, something outside of
Hmm.
themselves. So everyone's following somebody, even if they think they're only following their heart. And so I think it's a way more honest and authentic vision of what it means to be human to say, I'm going to follow Jesus because he's the true image of God and he is the true human. And so I'm going to become like that.
Yeah, and I think it's great, and I think that it should be appealing for people too, because I feel like we also live in this time of everyone's trying to hack life. You know, they're trying to squeeze every ounce of performance out of, you know, they're everyone's working to make better humans, right? We're trying to get every last ounce of productivity or, performance or whatever it is out of what it is to be human. And, all along the ultimate hack for being a human has been there from the beginning,
Yeah.
and living it to the full
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
is this picture of being
Yeah.
with Jesus, becoming
Yeah.
like Jesus.
Living in this partnership with God, living in this partnership with Jesus, and therefore out of that, extending his purposes, his plans, his wisdom, his goodness, his way of life into the world. I mean yeah, that's what it means to image God, right? We were created as images of God to image God by living in partnership with him. We went our own way, did our own thing. God in his mercy and grace through Jesus has called us back to himself, restored us to himself, complete amnesty, and now has come to live with us by his spirit so that as he pours out his love, his grace, his wisdom into us, we now get to reflect that back into the world as we become more and more like Jesus and more human. Um, that's good for us. It's good for our families. It's good for our neighborhoods. It's good for our communities. It's ultimately good for the world.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's the vision of discipleship. Vision of discipleship is what we've said. Arrange your life. It doesn't happen on accident. No, again, John Mark Homer, no accidental saints. Doesn't happen on
Hmm.
accident. So you're going to have to make some adjustments. Arrange your life to be with Jesus in order to become like Jesus. That is the essence of what it means to live as a disciple. And I think this is just so important for us just to constantly remind ourselves of this is what we're after. This is who we are. This is what Jesus calls us to. This is what it means to ultimately be a Christian, is to be a disciple of Jesus who does just that, who lives their life in such a way that they're increasingly becoming like Jesus as they trust him and follow him, listen to him, and put his teachings into practice. And so that's the essence of it. And we're going to continue this conversation in future weeks and just kind of keep reflecting on things out of this book, Practicing the Way, as well as other things that relate to how can we do this? How can we live this out as disciples of Jesus? So look forward to talking with you some more in future episodes as Stephen and I just kind of process this theme of disciple making and discipleship together. All right. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Bible and Life podcast. I pray that this discussion was helpful to you as a follower of Jesus, both for yourself, but also for helping other people follow Jesus well, too. The Bible and Life is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity of tons of folks just like you. So if you're one of those who have supported this ministry or continue to regularly support this ministry, thanks a ton. God is using your generosity to make a difference in the lives of people all around the world. And if you've been blessed or impacted in some way by this ministry, would you prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters? Easiest way to do that is to go to johnwhittaker.net, click the Give button, and it'll redirect you to my page with World Family Mission, where you can set up a one-time or a recurring monthly donation. Thanks a ton for your support.